coronavirus criticism over its handling of the country's borders.
This is now the time for personal responsibility, cautious personal responsibility.
I think people just want clarity because people want to do the right thing.
Versus a spike, scientists warned the Prime Minister that the vaccine push might not be enough to halt the Indian variant spread. Playing fast and loose with the peace process, the new DUP leader tells Sky News Boris Johnson should be ready to scrap the Northern Ireland Protocol. The teenage victims of the pandemic, Sky News goes inside an eating disorder unit as the government says mental health must be a new focus. And running off with the finishing line to freedom, we take a look at the day's cartoons and talking points as Boris Johnson prepares for Prime Minister's questions. Good morning, welcome to All Out Politics. Give the country a clear answer on holidays. That's the call from the opposition this morning as the government faces criticism for failing to give a concise message on travelling abroad. European Union ambassadors are meeting today in a move that could see them allow fully vaccinated UK tourists to visit Europe this summer without restriction. But with questions over whether countries on the amber list can be visited or not, there's a growing confusion about the rules. Earlier, the Skills Minister, Gillian Keegan, told Sky News the government is trusting the public to take personal responsibility and do the right thing.
This is now the time for personal responsibility, cautious personal responsibility. The British public have been amazing, both in getting the vaccine and, adhering to all the lockdown rules. This has been about really allowing on the great British public, relying on them being sensible and looking at the guidance that we put in place and taking their own decisions, really. But no, we wouldn't advise going on holiday to the amber list countries.
But Labour says the government must make the rules clear.
I think people just want clarity because people want to do the right thing. I mean, people feeling so desperate. There are people who will want a holiday. I mean, I was in the House of Commons on Monday and Matt Hancock was asked explicitly about this. Should people go on holiday if the country's on the amber list? He said no, they shouldn't. And another Tory MP jumped up and said, well, you've effectively made the amber list the red list. So people just want clear guidance.
So what are the government's current guidelines? The government says people should not travel to a country on the red list. Only British or Irish nationals will be allowed to enter the UK from places on that list. And they'll have to quarantine in a government-chosen hotel for 10 days and take 2 COVID tests. People are advised not to travel to countries on the amber list for holidays, but people are allowed to travel for essential reasons. Anyone returning from an amber list country has to quarantine at home for 10 days. And finally, the all-important green list. People returning from any of these 12 destinations don't need to quarantine unless they test positive for COVID-19. It's worth remembering there are strict rules around testing before and after travel from any country. Well, with me is our political correspondent, Kate McCann. Tried to make it clear there, but it's fair to say government's still got some work to do to stop people complaining that it's all a bit confusing.
Or they might not do that work, because they may be doing a shift. There may be a shift happening. And I think that's what Gillian... Well, I think that's what Gillian Keegan was trying to get to this morning, this idea that actually it's down to personal responsibility. And I thought it was really interesting that as a government minister out to discuss this policy, she made it clear that this isn't legislation. This is advice, and the government advises you not to travel to these countries. But ultimately, if you choose to do that, that's down to your personal assessment of the risk. Now, I think what the government is assuming is that most people are going to be risk averse. They're going to be very careful. They want to get vaccinated. We know that vaccine take-up in this country has been very strong, continues to be so in most areas. They're relying on the fact that people are taking responsibility for their own judgments. And it's not just about holidays, it's about hugging your relatives, about overnight stays, particularly in areas where the Indian variant is prevalent and growing. But you're right, Adam, that does leave some of us in a difficult situation, because it might mean that you have to make a choice and you're not clear about exactly what you should and shouldn't do. I think this is going to be the problem going forward, because the case rates in the country are relatively low, even of the Indian variant. And while there is some concern and not enough data to really say for certain that the vaccine is working. I think the general signs are that it is quite positive. That's why the Prime Minister is still saying that June 21st is possible. So we're moving into a stage now where people are going to have to take some of those risks and move out of being told exactly what to do as the pandemic eases off. That's not to say things might not change, though.
Prime Minister bound to face questions on travel at Prime Minister's Questions today, but also, what about this question of whether the government got it wrong on not shutting down people coming from India sooner?
I think that's a much more difficult one for the Prime Minister, and he may well be asked about the statistics that Matt Hancock, his Health Secretary, presented in the House of Commons. You and I were talking about those yesterday. Ed Conway, our data editor, made very clear that actually what he'd seen in the data did not match what Matt Hancock had said about the number of people coming into the country with the Indian variant at a particular time. Questions about why Indian travel, to and from India wasn't shut down sooner. Questions about why direct flights from India are still landing, and also the implications for people who are travelling and then coming back into the UK, standing in a queue next to people coming in from India who are coming in under very different rules on a red list country than if you're travelling on a green list. Those will be questions the Prime Minister is likely to face today.
OK, I know you're going to want to hear this. The Prime Minister's former senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, since leaving Downing Street, has been criticising the handling of the early stages of the pandemic. He's due to give evidence to MPs, and he's just been speaking.
What do you think the government did get wrong?
It's a good try. Good for you. I'm not going to say anything now about it. I'm going to speak next week.
Do you take any responsibility?
Lots, of course.
Do you think Dominic's the right man? Dominic, do you think Boris is the right man for the job?
Joke this morning, he breaks his self-imposed silence even more than Prince Harry. But Kate McCann, how worried is the government about this upcoming evidence session?
I think they'll be very worried, not least because Dominic Cummings is threatening to reveal documents that are confidential about the way the government handled the pandemic. And it goes to what you're talking about with the Indian question about travel. All of the government's decisions are going to be scrutinised. There's a National Audit Office report out today suggesting that the government wasn't prepared enough for the pandemic. It's not the first time that's been said. There will be a full investigation. If Dominic Cummings is preparing to really lift the lid on how some of those decisions were made in those early days, that could be incredibly damaging for the Prime Minister, who, was operating at a time when we didn't have all the information. It's going to be really interesting to see how far he's willing to go when he does go before that committee.
Kate McCann, thank you very much indeed. PMQs, of course, at noon. And we'll also be hearing from the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. He's giving a Downing Street briefing later on today, I think around 5 p.m. And we'll bring you that live here on Sky News. The all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus has criticised the unforgivable failure of the government after reports of passengers queuing for hours at airports, side by side with arrivals from red list countries such as India. Well, joining me now is the vice chair of that group, the Green MP Caroline Lucas. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. What is happening at airports as far as people coming back to the country?
We heard evidence at our all-party parliamentary group hearing, evidence from the Border Force Union, for example, talking about how people are being forced to stand right next to people who've come back from red list countries. So red list and green list are mixing in those arrival halls. There isn't adequate separation, and there certainly isn't adequate ventilation either. There's a real concern about the amount of time people are having to wait to get through the arrival halls. Clearly, there's going to take more time to check people's certificates of testing and so forth. But that means that sometimes people are milling around for hours and hours. If they're already doing that for up to 3 or 4 hours at a time right now, then how many more hours are people going to have to wait if indeed more travel does happen and more leisure travel is allowed to happen? So I think there are real concerns about the dangers of the virus spreading in our arrival halls. I think there is an absolute farce from the government over the last 24 hours in terms of the advice that's being given to people. I heard your piece just now with Gillian Keegan saying, their advice is to follow the guidance. But the guidance is utterly, utterly unclear. We've had 3 different ministers giving 3 different bits of advice over the last 24 hours, and the Prime Minister contradicting all of them. If it wasn't so serious, it really would be farcical.
The message appears to be use your common sense. Can I ask you, would you advise your constituents to travel to a green light country?
Personally, I still wouldn't at the moment until at least the following things have been sorted out. First is that those airport arrangements need to be sorted out so that people who are going to green list countries don't end up standing for hours next to someone who's been in a red list country, because that simply undermines the whole system. What I would really want to see as well is more effort taken to check things like these testing certificates, because again, more evidence that we heard at our all-party group was that the border force are picking up around 100 a day false certificates. So we need to make sure that people aren't coming in fraudulently. We also need vitally, and I don't know how many times I've said this, and so many other people have said it too, we need to get the isolation part of test, trace, isolate properly working. We know that even when people have been identified as being infected or at risk of being infected, that self-isolation isn't happening in the way it should, because far too many people simply can't afford to self-isolate. So we need to get the basics right. And that is why we use the word unforgivable, because it is unforgivable that this far into the pandemic, the government still hasn't got those basics right.
What about amber? Should orange be the new red?
Well, you know, we've got all the colours of the rainbow here and no one's any the wiser. It does seem from the most recent advice that amber is the new red. In other words, what is the point of amber if it actually means don't go anywhere? But then even as soon as we think we've made that conclusion, you have the Welsh Secretary saying, well, actually, some holidays are essential travel. Well, that isn't how most people understand what essential travel is. So we are going deeper and deeper into an Alice in the Wonderland hole, and it's really serious because people's lives are at risk.
So how could the government, the Prime Minister, Matt Hancock, how could they clear the air on this and sort it out?
Well, they could be much clearer about the meaning of the traffic light system if they're going to continue to use it. As I say, I still have grave doubts about that whole system if it completely goes to pieces once people get into an airport arrival hall. Because if the different colours are then all mixing up, then it doesn't really much matter which country you've just come from, you're going to be at risk. I also worry that the whole traffic light system is based on the idea that when you go to a country that is a green country, it may well be that that host country doesn't have high rates of infection, but you don't know who you're going to be mixing with from other countries who've come on holiday to that same green destination. Personally, I think we should be much, much clearer that right now we shouldn't be pursuing leisure travel. And I know that's a big ask, and I know people are desperate to get away, and I'm desperate to get away, and I understand that. But I think most people on balance would feel that it's a price worth paying if we can have far more freedoms inside our country, if the price we pay for that is to have stronger, firmer border measures.
Do you agree with the government that given the present outbreak, particularly related to the Indian variants, that the way to deal with it now, given the level of vaccination, is to have surge vaccinations and tracing rather than lockdowns, either locally or nationally?
I certainly think that most of the evidence seems to suggest that local lockdowns don't tend to work because quite often those borders between the different areas of lockdown spread, and by the time the lockdown has been imposed, it's often too late. It's done, you know, after the horse has bolted, if you like. So I do have concerns about that. I do come back to my point about test, trace, isolate, and I know it's sounding boring because I say it every time, but unless we have that system working, then all of the rest of the architecture falls apart. We need to know that if someone has been asked to isolate, that they can afford to do so. In other countries, they get this right because they allow people to have full pay while they are self-isolating. They make sure that if you're in a house of multiple occupation, you can stay in a hotel at no expense to yourself if that's a way of enabling you to self-isolate more safely. It's not rocket science. Could we just please get this right? And then we might have a chance of getting out of this awful pandemic.
Caroline Lucas, MP for Brighton Pavilion, as you can see from the wall decoration behind you. Thank you very much indeed. Inflation has risen to the highest level since the start of the pandemic. Data from the Office for National Statistics shows it went up to 1.5% in April. Energy prices fueled much of that increase they went up by 8.5% in April. The price of clothing and footwear also rose by 2.4%. Meanwhile, house prices have recorded an annual increase of 10% in the year to March 2021. That is the highest growth rate since 2007. Our business presenter, Ian King, is in the city. And Ian, I know this is a big debate amongst financiers, bankers and businesses. Is inflation back?
That's absolutely right, Adam. Yeah, there is a big debate about whether this is just transitory in the jargon down to so-called base effects or whether it's more permanent. So to explain what that means, base effects is that the year-on-year comparison is naturally going to lead to a certain level of inflation anyway. If you cast your mind back to April last year, where you saw some oil price contracts actually going negative at some point, the oil price has risen by some 60% since the beginning of November, and accordingly that is feeding through to higher inflation. And you've also got bottlenecks in terms of supplies of various commodities around the world, and some manufactured goods, they've either been stuck at ports or they haven't been getting through at all, and that, needless to say, adds to inflationary effects anyway. Now, the big debating point is whether this is just a natural spike that was to be expected or whether there is something more deep-seated going on right now. And you can pick and choose your answers accordingly. But it's worth pointing out that commodity prices are really going up very, very dramatically in a lot of instances. For example, copper, which is nicknamed Dr. Copper by traders because it's such a barometer of global economic activity. Well, that hit an all-time high last week. You've seen aluminium and tin, which are used from everything from power cables to circuit boards. Their prices have been rising to 10-year highs. In so-called soft commodities, you've seen the likes of wheat and corn hitting prices that they've barely been at for a decade or so. And lumber, which is a key input for the construction industry, well, that costs 4 times what it did this time last year. So you can see there are an awful lot of inflationary pressures building up. Now, the view of the Bank of England and indeed the US Federal Reserve has just been to sort of look through this and say, we expected this, it's going to feed its way through the system, it's no reason for us to be acting on interest rates and overdoing things, the panic. The inflation rate, of course, is some 2%. That's the Bank of England's target. But it's worth pointing out that other measures of inflation, for example, RPI, which we don't talk about much these days, well, according to the latest figures, that's up at 3.2%. Now, while those aren't used as official Bank of England targets, for a lot of people, they still feel the effects of these price increases, and likewise house prices, which, as you say, we've seen running at very, very strong levels right now as well. But if you widen it out, Adam, and look to other things that are going on in the economy, both here and around the world, well, if you look at money supply, for example, now, when we were back in the 1980s and the monetarists held sway, well, they said, if you watch the rise in the money supply, well, that leads to higher inflation. The money supply right now is growing in the United States at 24%. Any monetarist economist will tell you that means higher inflation. It's very interesting. Larry Summers, overnight, Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, he's warning that the Federal Reserve's reluctance to move on interest rates and wind in quantitative easing is leading to some real imbalances in financial markets. So this does have a lot of implications.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Ian King there. The new leader of Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party has told Sky News maintaining a Brexit border in the Irish Sea is, quotes, playing fast and loose with the peace process. In his first interview since being elected to take over from Arlene Foster, Edwin Poots called on the British government to go it alone if necessary and scrap the controversial protocol. He's been speaking to our Ireland correspondent, David Blevins.
What if the government doesn't remove the protocol and it is enshrined in international law? What happens at that point?
I would say at that point they're playing fast and loose with the peace process, and that is something which is hugely regrettable. They're playing fast and loose with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and that is something which they are co-guarantors for. So we really need government to sit up and recognise that the damage that is being done. We need the European Union to recognise that they have overplayed their hand in what they have proposed.
Isn't your fierce opposition to the protocol, though, conceding that the DUP made the wrong call in not accepting a softer Brexit proposed by Theresa May?
Well, we couldn't have delivered that for Theresa May. That was something that she lost herself in Westminster. So the DUP, whether it supported it or against it, it wasn't going through in any event.
But it's not within your gift to remove it. So what are you actually asking of the British government?
Well, it's not my gift, but it is my gift to make forceful arguments for its removal. And I believe that we have a very powerful message, and that message is getting through to government of the damaging consequences to people in Northern Ireland. So we need to get to a circumstance where I'm sure the European Union don't really want to do harm to the people of Northern Ireland. And the European Union recognise with the UK government that they need to draw back. If not, we'll be calling the UK government to go it alone.
For people beyond Northern Ireland, what's the difference between Edwin Poots and Arlene Foster?
Well, in terms of policy, there is very little difference. I want to be very frank with people, explain my position to them, and I want to work for all of the people of Northern Ireland, irrespective of their backgrounds. So it doesn't matter whether you're nationalist, unionist, or what diverse background you come from in terms of race, religion, sexuality or anything else. Edwin Poots wants to do work for you.
For many people, that will be a surprise because some of your strongly held conservative views on social issues are well documented. So have you changed position on those issues, or what would you say to people who believe some of the views you've expressed in the past would render you out of touch?
You see, people can make all of these suggestions, and I would say to people that they should judge me on delivery, and they will find that my focus will be ensuring that we deliver for every citizen in Northern Ireland, irrespective of where they come from.
Excavation work has begun in Gloucester, where 15-year-old Mary Bastholm went missing in 1968. This comes after police found possible new evidence at Clean Plate Cafe in the search for the suspected victim of the serial killer Fred West. Let's get the latest from our correspondent Dan Whitehead in Gloucester. Dan.
Yeah, Adam, this morning we've seen a number of tools and officers going into the tent behind me here. We've seen spades going in, wooden planks, various power tools, all part of the equipment that the police here in Gloucester are going to need over the next couple of weeks as they begin to excavate the 6 voids, as they named them yesterday, essentially areas underneath the cellar, gaps in the ground which are of interest. This, of course, all came to light when a film production crew identified some blue material in one of those voids. They were filming here a documentary about the missing Mary Bastholm, who went missing in 1968. They alerted police, and here we are with this investigation now. Police say it's going to take a number of weeks, at least 2 weeks, as they go through those 6 areas, those voids underneath the basement. In terms of the investigation and interviews, there have been reports over the last few hours as to whether or not Rose West will be interviewed as part of police inquiry. She is still serving a life sentence. Of course, Mary's disappearance has long been linked to the serial killer Fred West, who was charged with the murder of 12 young women between the late 60s and 80s. Now, this morning I've been speaking to Rose West's former solicitor, Leo Goatley. He believes that actually Rose West probably does have information on Mary, and he told me he hopes she is interviewed by police.
I would hope that she is questioned, but I just don't think it'll get anywhere unless there's been some sort of major shift in her mindset that would make her volunteer things. But I think she's put a great big wall up, and she has this persona of a gentle, kind, ageing lady who's not in the best of health, who likes her cooking and sewing and keeping out of trouble. So the horrors of her past, I just don't think she'll want to revisit.
We'll have to see whether or not that happens. The process here, though, is now getting underway. We've seen around 5 or 6 officers going in throughout the morning with that equipment. The van parked out here. They'll be in there for the next couple of weeks. Meticulous and painstaking work is what we're told it'll be if they are going to find anything. And, of course, anything they do find then has to be taken away and undergo DNA tests and forensics. So it's going to be some time before we get any conclusive answers.
Thank you very much, Dan Whitehead in Gloucester there. Eating disorder services in England say that they've seen a massive increase in young patients since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. Referrals have doubled in the past year, and it's thought lockdown caused many young people to miss out on vital help. 2/3 of young people say their mental health got worse during the lockdowns. They are more likely to have experienced poor mental health than adults, and that's led to a doubling of referrals for help with eating disorders. Recent NHS data shows a fourfold increase in the number of children and young people waiting for urgent care, and a 129% increase in the numbers waiting for routine treatment over the past year. Our People and Politics correspondent Nick Martin has spent the last 3 weeks with the staff and patients of the Pennine Care NHS Trust. Warning, his report on their work contains references to self-harm, suicide and ligatures, images of self-harm, references to eating disorders and pictures of nasogastric tubes.
The first thing you notice here are the locks. There are locks on every door.
This is our airlock. Because a lot of the young people are detained, it's just an extra security measure. So one door has to lock before the other opens.
I see, OK. Inside, it's an uneasy combination of children's ward and prison wing.
50 milligrams of sertraline, which is an antidepressant. 50 milligrams of quetiapine. It's a antipsychotic for low mood and suicidal ideation.
This is a place where severe illness meets severe treatment.
Should we cover it up just so it doesn't get infected, yeah? Yeah. Oh, I've got to clean it off anyway. Come on. At least this will stop anything getting into it.
So this is Horizon Ward. This is a 10-bedded unit. 6 of these beds are for eating disorders.
It's 7 a.m. and night staff hand over to the day team.
She did tie a ligature at 10 o'clock. It was removed by the ligature knife. Physical observations were completed. There were no concerns. It was quite tight, so she was gasping for breath afterwards. So she did have a brief period of head banging at 11 o'clock. We followed the management plan, went in every 5 minutes.
Horizon is a secure psychiatric unit for children and young people. And meal times can be difficult in a place where no one wants to eat.
It's the most difficult part of the day.
First, patients are offered food. If they refuse, they're offered this.
What's in it?
Ultimately calories, but more than that, it's like all the nutrients.
Yeah.
So vitamins, minerals, everything that the body needs to sort of function on a day-to-day basis.
The pandemic is fueling an alarming rise in eating disorders. In the past year, cases have doubled. And demand for beds on wards like this one is up by a fifth.
She won't come out at the moment. Sometimes she comes.
It's not long before they discover that a patient is refusing to eat.
Are you sure there's nothing we can do to help? Because I know it's really difficult. We need to try and beat it, don't we? And not come out for a little bit.
Nurse Kat tries to support the youngster, but time has run out.
15 minutes, we draw the feed up and bring her out.
Does she know
Yeah.
that the clock is ticking?
Yeah, so the young people are aware of it. They know the timings really well.
This is what we call an NG tube. It's inserted through the nostril, goes up and then down the esophagus into the stomach, and it allows us to syringe feed. It's the only way. Either you do something quite brutal or you let a 14-year-old, 15-year-old become so physically compromised that they could ultimately die or go into organ failure.
The eating disorder anorexia nervosa has this young girl in the tightest of grips. Supported by nurses, she's taken to a room, and behind this door, that high-calorie formula is injected into the feeding tube.
I don't know how to feel about it, really, having witnessed it. This is the end of the process, and we've just seen that young girl being marched down that corridor by nurses who describe this as not a battle between nurse and patient, but a battle between nurse and eating disorder. This girl doesn't want to eat, but now she's being forced to eat.
we're seeing a massive increase in young people that are coming in that are saying, I tried to get better at home and the support just wasn't there because the community teams are absolutely backlogged. People aren't having as many face-to-face appointments. Everything's done over online, and I think a lot of our young people have been saying it's so easy to lie and say you're fine on an online appointment, and it's not until they get to the point where they're probably bordering on coming in here that we realise how severe things actually are.
But there's a problem. There just aren't enough of these places to meet this surge in demand. And so a crisis is now emerging. Nick Martin, Sky News.
If you've been affected by any of the issues in Nick's report, you can contact the Samaritans on 116 123 or the eating disorder charity Beat Helpline on 0808 801 0677. Well, earlier, the Skills Minister, Gillian Keegan, told Sky News the government was looking into providing specialist equipment seen in our report there. She says the mental health of young people must be a top priority.
You know, those highly specialised beds that you saw in your clip, you know, there aren't enough of them, and in particular access around the country. But yes, it is definitely something that we have a huge focus on. Mental health in general, but eating disorders, self-harm and young people's mental health is particularly concerning.
And we're going to hear more from Nick throughout this week with a series of special reports on the impact of COVID on children's mental health. This is All Out Politics coming up next. It's raining outside, the pub is open, but this cartoon focuses on mixed messaging over the roadmap out of lockdown. We'll take a look at that and all the opinions and talking points from today's newspapers and websites in The View.
Well, I think one of the things that we've all realised during this pandemic is how important our well-being and our mental health is. Now, of course, it's important to separate mental illness from well-being and health. But I think all of us have wanted to take control, I think, and do a bit more to look after ourselves ultimately. And, you know, whether that's getting outside more often, catching some natural light, exercising, communicating with those that we hold dear, making sure we're managing our stress effectively, we're sleeping well. All these things play a part into how we feel. And so, you know, that's why I wrote the book Live Well Every Day. I wanted to kind of bring the science out there, my personal experience and my professional experience, and put that together into, I guess, key chapters that people hopefully can use to improve their own health and ultimately feel better from it. I think it's been different for everyone. Everyone is different. Everyone's an individual, and I think the pandemic, in whatever way, has put pressure on everyone. Whether you're on the front line working in A&E, or you're working as a carer, or whether you're at home shielding, you know, and there's so many people that have felt so much stress and pressure for different reasons or isolation, and it's impacted everyone. You know, and if you look at even, you know, the roadmap at the moment, people going back, you know, coming out of this pandemic, some people are really wanting to rush back to busy shops and get going again. Others are much more cautious. And I think this pandemic has really, really taught us to listen to the way we feel, do things in the way that we're comfortable to do, and especially going back to, you know, normality. You know, take things at your own time and look after yourself. I really, really, really hope that a lot of things we've learned from this pandemic about self-care, about investing in yourself and your own time, your own energy, we'll take that forward after the pandemic, because a lot of us have been burning the candle at both ends for far too long.
This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Time now for The View, the latest opinions and talking points in the papers and news websites today. The cartoon The Guardian goes with criticism of mixed messaging from the government. The pub is open inside, the rain is pouring outside, and you have Boris Johnson there at the door saying, you're welcome to go in, but I wouldn't. The Daily Telegraph cartoon goes on the theme of moving the goalposts. Boris Johnson and the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, are pictured sprinting away with the finishing line to freedom. The headline for Marina Hyde in The Guardian says things must be bad, Hancock's being rolled out. Her article suggests that given the Prime Minister said lockdown easing will be cautious but irreversible, it's likely to lack caution and involve reversals. Matt Hancock giving a news conference this evening. Writing in the Daily Telegraph, Philip Johnson refers to frustration over the possibility of fresh restrictions. He says, direct your anger at the lockdown obsessives, not the unvaccinated few, as he asked whether COVID jabs should be mandatory. In the same paper, Dor Gold turns attention to the Middle East. He writes that it isn't just the security of Israel at stake, but the security of the wider Western alliance as well, given Iran's involvement. And The Sun calls on the Prime Minister to sign a free trade deal with Australia, saying Brexit will be a roaring success only if we grasp its golden new opportunities. Well, joining us today to look through those are the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt, and the Times columnist, Melanie Phillips. Nice to see you both. And Ian, let's talk about the Middle East first of all. That article by Dor Gold there, making the point that as we cover the conflict, we're not hearing a lot about Iran's undoubted involvement.
I don't know so much about that. I mean, Israeli government officials very often talk about Iran's involvement. It's links with Hamas. We see that quite frequently in right-wing newspapers. The trouble is, because we all have this sense of horrified emotional anguish of what we see, people will seek someone to blame. It's quite easy just to pick one of those. Whereas, in fact, the blame is spread really very evenly indeed. And if you're going to write an article that's talking about Iran and Hamas, it would also make at least some sense to talk about Netanyahu's grotesque, persistent attempts to entrench inequality and hostility between groups within Israel, the very aggressive use of Israeli military techniques in the occupied territories, and on and on. So it becomes part of the infinite blame game, when in reality, right now, there is more than enough blame to go around.
Melanie, I mean, it was what was happening in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, which appears to have sparked this latest round of hostilities rather than Iran, wasn't it?
Well, I think there are a number of possible reasons why it was sparked, and maybe no one in particular. One of the most important was the rivalry between Hamas and Fatah. Mahmoud Abbas cancelled the planned elections for the Palestinian Authority, in which he was going to lose to the Hamas. And the Hamas then, quite reasonably from their point of view, decided to launch a war to show that, you know, they could take the fight to the enemy much better than Mahmoud Abbas.
Weren't they responding to what happened at Damascus Gate and what happened on the Temple Mount as well, rather than actually...
Well, what happened at the Temple... Indeed, I'm glad you made that. I'm glad you raised that point. What happened at the Temple Mount was that the Palestinian Arabs used the mosque, Al-Aqsa Mosque, as an ammunition point where they stored rocks and Molotov cocktails with which they started to assault Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall and other Jews in the city, as well as the police. The Damascus Gate the Israeli police sought to defuse the situation by restricting admission. So let's get it right. The Israelis have all the time been responding to Arab aggression.
Ian?
It just seems a very sort of simplistic assessment of what's going on. And the danger is every time that we just say all of the blame lands on one side and none of the blame lands on the other, you have a rather obvious continuation of the grim cycle in which we see there is no moral comparison. There is a very difficult case to make when you're talking about an occupying force and an occupied force. There is also a very severe distinction in the level of power, in the level of money, in the level of equipment that is being operated. There is a very severe distinction in the level of loss of life. Now, these are grim ratios that we use. But in each and every time we see these conflicts mount, it's about 1 in 10. 10 Palestinians killed to 1 Israeli, and right now the figures are considerably higher than that, including dozens of children so far. It's no point just saying that these children are sort of collateral damage as the result of Hamas, choosing to use them as human shields. The reality is that the Gaza Strip is an open prison. It is the third densest polity in the world. If you keep people in those conditions very close together, anytime you launch a military endeavour in that territory, you will find that you are killing women and children, and that is precisely what has taken place.
Melanie?
Well, this is just, Ian talks about, emotion getting in the way. My goodness me, this is just emotional ignorance, really quite extraordinary ignorance. Israel has had so far something like 3,700 rockets coming at it from Gaza. Those rockets are all intended to kill Israeli civilians. That is a war crime. the undoubted casualties among civilians in Gaza are almost all to do with the fact that either the Hamas have deliberately sited their weapons of annihilation against Israel under and in apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, and so on. Secondly, which makes their own civilians hostages, human shields, and cannon fodder. The Israelis actually, unlike any other armed militia in the world, warns civilians to get out of civilian-occupied buildings in various ways. The Hamas are known over many years to tell the captive Palestinians in those buildings, captive by Hamas, not to move in order that they should die, in order that they should be killed, in order that useful idiots like Ian will then find a moral equivalence. Finally, there is the issue of the Hamas rockets falling short, and we don't know how many. The Israelis say 1/3 of the Hamas rockets are falling short in Gaza. It is reasonable to suppose that some of those casualties in Gaza of civilians have been killed by the Hamas's own rockets.
Well, I did want to move on, but Ian, I'll give you a final quick reply to that.
I mean, there's nothing much to say. Hamas is a death-loving, totalitarian, terrorist cult. That is clearly what it is. That in and of itself does not mean that Israel is not responsible for the actions that it takes. It is responsible when it bombs the buildings containing journalists, when it kills women and children. And any kind of moral assessment that looks at that situation and says Hamas bad, Israel good, is obviously deeply simplistic.
All right, Melanie, from your perspective, do you think that the British government is now moving the goalposts and making a bit of a mess of coming out of this pandemic?
Well, a mess, yes. I think it's made a mess from the start because it's reacted too slowly from the start to the evidence that was being put before it. But the goalposts are moving. You can't blame the government for the fact that the Indian variant has suddenly arrived. And that causes chaos. So I have every sympathy with the government at this stage in being cautious and saying to the public very honestly, we don't know whether we can open up after June the 22nd and the 21st in the way that we wanted to, because we're concerned about this variant. Where I think they are completely at fault, and I find this baffling now, and I have found it baffling throughout the pandemic, is that while the British public are being locked down and, with all the problems that has caused and the resentment, the airports have